Okay, so we've talked about duplicates. We've talked about repeated ordinances. We've talked about the Holocaust stuff. What were some of the, tell us about working for the church, and what were some of the joys and difficulties of your time there, and some of the main projects you worked on, or some of the more interesting things that you had to deal with?
A few things. First of all, it was an incredibly fun job. I got to work with people every day and help them find their ancestors, or manage people who did. And I don't know. There's something quite like that moment when you're in the library sitting with someone, and they have been working on a genealogical problem for a while, and they find that ancestor and learn something about them. And there's just, I don't know, there's something just incredibly joyful, just incredibly powerful about those moments. And I loved that. It was incredibly fun to help people discover themselves through their ancestors. And I don't know that I've ever had anything else quite like that, in terms of just that, the spiritual element of it, just personal element of it. Incredibly fun job. And
I think we refer to that as the spirit of Elijah.
Yeah.
It's the joy of genealogy. It's getting to know who we are through our ancestors. It's connecting back to our ancestors. It's a beautiful premise. And I think it begins with Joseph Smith. We've talked about this. Hiram, Alvin dies.
Right.
And the Presbyterian minister says Alvin's going to hell. And Lucy freaks out and is, well, okay, my son's now going to hell because he didn't get his work done. It has to be the baptism for the dead came out of Joseph worrying about Alvin and other family members who had died. And
I think so.
So it starts there, but it's more than that. It's connecting generations.
And while genealogists are sometimes our crazy aunt that gets really involved in genealogy and tries to pull everyone in. They're fun people, and just they've captured the joy of what this is. But I think everybody, to some extent, and you see the direction in which the family tree is moving now as being much more about how to connect you and tell you about your ancestors, create stories, help you connect with them in emotional kinds of ways, and as you take them to the temple. And so that's a big part of it. And I love that part. But transformative things, I think online indexing is huge. It's transformed the industry. Ancestry, I would say, is the first one that started really digitizing records. So when I left, the vault was about 30% digitized. In terms of the microfilm in there being digital images on FamilySearch. I suspect they're probably more than 50 or 60% done now. They might even be close to done because they were trying to find ways to accelerate it.
So there are all these records that were...
digitizing the microfilm is the easy part.
Well, these microfilm comes from where?
All over the world. So these are the cameras that went all over the world to archives and took pictures of birth records, death records, marriage records, military records.
The church paid for this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, many millions of dollars have been spent in this. I'm sure probably several $1 billion over the course of the Genealogical Society of Utah, adjusted for inflation in particular. It's a huge effort. I don't remember exactly what the budget for the Family History Department is, but $200 million-ish a year, I would guess, is going into family history from a church perspective.
And so the church has all this microfiche in a vault, and it's trying to digitize all that. Why?
Right. Up at the Granite Mountain Record Vault, there's masters for all of these master microfilms for all these records, and you have to duplicate them about once every 30, 40 years because they degrade over time. So digitizing them for two reasons. One, access, so that individuals can look at them from home and be able to do family history without going to a family history center and ordering microfilm. And two, because digital images don't degrade and microfilm does. Although the problem of preservation of a digital image over multiple hundred years is a problem that no one has solved yet, because digital images, while I say they don't degrade, they actually do. As you copy them, bytes flip. So you have to figure out a way to have high probability of copying, high fidelity of copying, so you don't lose bytes in the process. But the last is just the ability to easily do family history. So Ancestry, I think, was the first one that indexed the full set of U.S. censuses, and it transformed family history, because now you could search for a name and find them right in the census and find the information about them. And now I'm not sure what the count of indexed records is on FamilySearch. Last count I saw was somewhere around 7-8 billion records that were out there that you could then search. So now you didn't have to go look at the microfilm. So if you figure this process before today, I would find my ancestor, I'd try and find the locality that they lived in, and then I'd order the microfilm, hope I got the right one, and then I'd have to look through it image by image until I found my ancestor. And now I can just go online, I can search for my ancestor's name, I can see all the records they're in, I can click through it, and then I can find them on the digital image to see if it's really them. And then I can organize them. So the level of simplicity that's involved in that is dramatically better. And using some of the AI that's starting to develop now, you can start to assemble records together. So you can say, I actually think, so you'll see suggestions when you go into Family Tree. You'll see a suggestion pop up that says, we think we found a record for you. So it's basically looking through the records to try and find good matches and then serve those up for you to decide if this is actually the right person. So it's as well as suggesting individuals from records that we think match to individuals so that you can more easily do ordinances. And the net effect of this is that we went from almost being out of temple names for females to no longer using extracted names for temple work. So the year that I left, we had ceased using any extracted names for temple work. They were all member submitted that were going through for ordinances, and that's the first time I'm not sure, maybe the first time since late 1800s, early 1900s. Well, I guess first time since 1960 when the extraction program began, that the church has not used extracted names. So a significant milestone. And so the indexing now continues to happen, called indexing, not extraction. But it's all for helping members to find their ancestors. It's not to submit for temple ordinances.
Is it logical to assume that the mere fact that the church would spend millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to go capture all these microfiche and to store them and collect them for so many years suggests a real sincere belief, which for Orthodox members would be obvious, but for post-Mormons, there's a lot of suspicion. Does that mere act of all that money spent on genealogy suggest a real sincerity on the leader's part that this is divine work?
Sure. My experience with leaders is, first of all, I'd say they're people. So, I worked with, I don't know, I think I sent you the list of kind of apostles I'd worked with. I think it's 7 or so that I worked with over my time there. 3 or 4 really closely worked together, worked really closely with Elder Eyering. Elder Christofferson was actually the executive director of the department when I started. The executive director is kind of the general authority that's in charge of the department. Worked really closely with Elder Christofferson. Incredibly nice man. One of the most spiritual people I've ever known. So they all have their own personality. Some of them I liked more than others, to be honest. Some of them I thought were kind of jerks. But I think all of them genuine. I mean, it's one of the interesting things for me. I mean, maybe I've just was deceived at some point, and they really have ulterior motives and such. But my experience with them are genuine individuals who are doing the very best they can to try and make good decisions for the church, and genuinely believe it. So, they know whether or not they've seen God. I don't. So they have that set of knowledge that I don't. But I genuinely think they believe what they're teaching, and that they genuinely believe the church doctrines. And I didn't see any evidence that would lead me to believe otherwise in all of my interactions.
Okay.
So.
That's good. My brother has worked with many of them, and he reflects the same thing, that these are generally smart, capable, good people trying to do the best that they can.
Elder Eyering is incredibly smart. I mean, I had one experience with him. It's kind of interesting because I view it a little bit different in hindsight than I did then. But we were in the middle of rolling out FamilySearch, and as we did that, we rolled it out stake by stake because we had to convert the temple and we had to convert members. And it was both a load on the system and it was a lot of work in converting the temple over to using the new software. And so we had a rollout plan, which was super prescriptive. I was probably the primary author of the plan, and it gave very detailed instructions to priesthood leaders. And I'm sitting down with Elder Eyering, and he's basically counseling me on how is the right way and the wrong way to roll things out to church units, and that being super prescriptive to bishops and stake presidents is not the way the church operates. But then we had a really interesting conversation, which has stuck with me over the years, in which he talked about Revelation. And he said, one of the things that I continually work on within myself is knowing whether or not the revelation is from God or whether or not it's from me. And it struck me at the time because I struggled with this my entire life. When is it my head speaking or when is it the Spirit speaking to me? And it gave me a lot of comfort knowing that at least I wasn't in the boat alone. I had an apostle in there with me with this problem. Subsequently, I suppose I've reflected and thought, if Elder Eyering is representative of all the apostles, then it means that they struggle in many ways the same way that I do with knowing when it's them and when it's God. And I think it gives you a different perspective on when you're considering the things that they're communicating around your responsibility for understanding that, validating it with your own connection with God, because it may be from the Spirit or maybe from them. But it was it was an interesting moment with him.
It's kind of like we all see through a glass darkly, apostles included. And this would explain why Joseph Bishop could be called as a mission president.
Sure.
Because they're just doing the best that they can. And this would explain why bishops can also be embezzlers of funds or child molesters, because everyone all the way up to the top is seeing through a glass darkly and is just doing the best they can, but can also be prone to error.
Yeah. I mean, Elder Christofferson, in a kind of candid moment, he was being slightly humorous, but I think also a little self-deprecating. But I think the truth of it behind the words, he said something on the order of, "I wish I was 10% as good as 10% of the members thought I am." The fact is, I think a part of the problem of the church is what I would call this royalty that we've created in the general authorities. They're just people like us. I mean, they have a special calling, but they're just people, and they're just trying to do the best they can. And members put them on a pedestal saying they can never be wrong or they never say anything that's wrong. And I just think that's nonsense. I don't think they think that. And I don't think that. I think they try and do good things. I think this notion that they're, this notion that sits out there in the ex-Mormon community, that these are manipulative individuals, there's conspiracy theories. I don't know. I just don't see any evidence of that. I mostly just see good people trying to do the best they can, but people who make mistakes and who have their own background and prejudices and everything inside of that is a part of them, and just like we have. And they're no better nor worse, I think, than each one of us are.
You mentioned Oakes and Packer as having particular personalities and approaches. Do you have any stories or anecdotes about that?
It's really funny.
Or Nelson, by the way.
Yeah, President Nelson was the senior apostle on our council when I started. He in some ways was the one that surprised me a bit when I went in, because I would have described President Nelson is not my favorite speaker. I would say he is on the sugary sweet side from my perspective when he speaks in conference. And so it was always one of those, oh yeah, is this just sugar on top of sugar with President Nelson? And then when I met him and was presenting to him, he is like seriously all business. He is a serious driver, the kind of sugar. He is the one that I would say his conference persona is least like his, for me, is least like his personal style of engagement, which is very much a smart business person driving to objectives, cutting to the heart of issues, very much give me the facts, help me make decisions. Smart guy, actually good to work with. I enjoyed working with him, although I didn't work with him a lot. I presented to him probably, I don't know, maybe half a dozen times over the years. Elder Oakes is also interesting to me, really smart, really personable. I liked Elder Oaks. And I say liked because his latest General Conference talks make me crazy for both personal and kind of just broader reasons on the LGBTQ issues. But when I worked with him, he was one of my favorite apostles to work with, to be perfectly honest. He's smart and insightful and witty and funny and just super personable guy. I have a hard time reconciling that with the person that I see in conference that says moderately hateful things now from my perspective. But I liked working with him. Super nice guy.
And when you realize that he has a gay grandson, Jared Oaks.
Yeah, I just can't imagine. I just find it horrifying. Just horrifying.
It can't be just that he's evil, it's got to be, and a lot of other people have had good interactions with them. So it's something about the office.
I don't think any of them are evil, just to be clear. I think they are all good. Yeah. I think for whatever reason, and there's a lot of jokes out there about Elder Oaks and closeted and
him being closeted.
I just say jokes out there in the community because I don't know. There's this long running joke that says the more someone is
the
protests about being gay, the more likely they are to be gay in their private life. So
I know nothing about that.
I know absolutely nothing about this with Elder Oaks. So let's just be clear.
You say you've heard things like that?
Oh, I'm not at the church, just outside.
But with Kimball and Packer,
I just don't know. But I mean, he obviously believes it. I mean, and no one would say these kinds of things without personally believing it. And I don't think he hates anyone. I don't think he hates gay people. I don't think Elder Oaks hates anyone. I think he genuinely believes this is doctrinally wrong, and he's giving this counsel to keep people from making mistakes in their lives. It doesn't make it any better. I think it's still horrible what he's saying, and I see the effects of it. I mean, I'm Twitter friends with a bunch of gay students at BYU, and that's just seeing the effects of church leaders on these individuals is it's awful. I just don't know any other way to say it. So, but Elder Oaks personally, I like him a lot.
Okay.
He's super nice and very bright. Elder Eyering, again, just really great guy. Elder Bednar, honestly, was incredibly hard to read. You could present to Elder Bednar and get 2 words out of him out of the entire presentation. I don't know, one of the funniest interactions, and this will get maybe to a bit of foreshadowing, but I'm in that transition period in my life where I'm getting ready to leave church employment and probably not quite living my life in harmony with church teaching, but still working for the church and looking for another job. And I told them I was exiting. And anyway, so I happened to be up and I was meeting with, I can't remember, one of the 70s that was, when I was Elder Coleman, or one of the 70s had an office right across the hall from Elder Bednar. They share a secretarial area. And so I was going to meet them, and Elder Bednar happened to be there, and he said, "Hey, Don, it's good to see you." And I came in, and I'd lost quite a bit of weight. I'd probably lost 80 pounds over the previous couple of years. And he said, "Wow, you're just looking really, really great. I just, what are you doing?" And I said, it's that whole eat less, move more kind of thing. But that's probably one of the few times I've ever had kind of that personal little bit of connection with him. He is a really hard guy to get to know personally and really hard to present to. But I don't know, Elder Jensen, who was our executive director for a few years, again, just one of the kindest, Marlon Jensen, yeah, was just one of the kindest, nicest, gentlest, most personable, loving people I've ever known. So I don't know, anybody who's out there in the ex-Mormon space who likes to think horrible things about the apostles, I don't know that I'll help them much, because my experience was genuinely good, and I found them to be genuinely good men just doing what they thought was right.
You had a story about hosting the 70s quorum Talk about that story.
It's funny, and this goes back to this whole royalty, us turning the 70s and the apostles into royalty. I used to joke when I worked there that we were just 100 years away from being Catholic and kneeling and kissing the rings of the apostles as they came into the rooms, as that's where we're headed. So we're the quorum of the 70s meeting. Our executive director had arranged to have the quorum of the 70s meetings held in the Family History Library, and at this point I was director of the Family History Library, so I was helping to get the event set up. So we had the AV guys all in, and we were setting up the room, and they were doing a run through of what it would be. And I don't know if I should use names here, but maybe I will. So Elder Packer, not Boyd, but Allan, his son, was our executive director. He was a member of the 70, and he was our executive director. So he's the one kind of doing this walkthrough. And at some point he stops us and he says, no, we cannot do it this way because you're not allowed to walk in front of the presidency of the 70. And this setup would require us to walk in front of them. And that's just simply completely against protocol. And I'm like, what the? I mean, I didn't say what the hell, but I thought it. What the hell are you talking about? These are just people. What do you mean you can't walk in front of them? You're not like God. I mean, they're just 70s. I mean, really. But it underlines, and I think a part of the challenge with being a general authority is you're in this bubble of people around you who want to be respectful, but almost take it to never tell you anything bad. I don't know. I was kind of a rebel, I guess, in my time at FamilySearch. I respected the general authorities because of their calling and because they're smart people, both. But I also knew that they're just people, and so I figured my job in working for the church was to tell them the things they needed to know, particularly the hard truths, so that they could make good decisions, and we could make good decisions together. And so I was probably one of the most outspoken and honest and just say things as they are. But I think there are a lot of people in church employment that are not like that, who don't want to carry the bad news, who don't want to say anything bad about a decision that's been made because it was made by apostles and therefore it can't be wrong. It's just a bunch of hooey. Apostles make wrong decisions all the time. The church internally changes direction, somewhat regularly in terms of what we're doing, because you try something and it doesn't work. And apostles are smart and they have a good view of the whole world. They're probably the best in terms of understanding the church and the scope of it, which is sometimes hard to see as an employee. But they travel so much and interact with enough members that they get a sense culturally that's hard to replicate outside of them. So they're great individuals to have in terms of counseling you on how to get things right and how to get them to move through church channels in the right way, which isn't always apparent as a church employee, and they're great at that. So anyway, it's funny, this church royalty thing.
Let's talk about how at church headquarters, the various departments usually have a couple apostles assigned to them, and then probably general authorities under them, and then how those things can rotate. Just give us a sense for how these departments are organized and how leadership happens.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of relate this to the civil service. So you've got the employees, which are often long-term employees. Matter of fact, I was at Roots Tech yesterday, and I've been gone from FamilySearch for 4 years now, but there's still people that I know that have worked there for 20 years and will probably be there until they retire. These are like nice, safe, long-term jobs. They don't pay that well, but they're nice, safe, long-term jobs. And what you have, so you kind of have this civil service of employees that's very durable over time, that has long-term institutional memory, that understands what's been tried, what's worked, what hasn't, that is generally like stability over change with some exceptions. And then you have the general authorities that rotate. So typically so you normally have as an executive director plus two or three assistant executive directors. So you've got the priesthood department, the temple department, the church history department, the missionary department, family history department, I might be missing one.
My brothers?
That's ICS, the Information Communication Systems. I think they're still called ICS. Maybe there's something different now, but it's basically the technology arm of the church. So there's those, and then there's a council that usually is so an executive director that's normally 70, and assistant executive directories that are first or second quorum 70, and then there'll be a council above that that has 2 or 3 apostles, often a member of the presiding bishopric, and a couple of 70s. That are a part of that. And that's essentially the way all the departments are governed. And they're governed as kind of individual entities, and then they kind of collaborate and work together-ish. But you have this kind of interesting thing where you've got a rotating general authority at the top and stability of employees below. And it creates this interesting dynamic of culture changing somewhat and priorities changing somewhat every 2 years, but a certain amount of resistance to that in some ways it takes longer to change than the general authority's tenure is, unless they're very, very active. And you got kind of somebody joked with me when I first started, a couple of funny jokes when I first started. The one was, in order to work for the church, you have to have a really strong testimony, because otherwise you won't be a member when you stop working there. And I think there's some truth to that you get to see how the sausage is made in working for the church.
And what are the types of stories or dealings that have happened that would, give us a sample of the types of things that would cause you to doubt the truthfulness of the church? The types of conflict or tension or
I don't know.
Inefficiency or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's probably all of that. I mean,
but not corruption, right? Corruption?
Not that I ever saw.
Okay.
I mean, if it's there, does money occasionally get stolen at a ward level and things like that? Sure, everybody knows about that. But the church is pretty diligent, I would say, with ensuring money doesn't get stolen. Does it get misused? Sure. I mean, there's waste at the church, like there isn't any big company. I mean, I don't know what the annual church budget is, but it's certainly in the billions. And when you have a multi-billion-dollar budget, you have waste inside of it of things that shouldn't happen. And it's a funny budgeting system. It's like a government budgeting system where once you appropriate something, it continues on with ongoing funding until you deappropriate it. So it's this interesting kind of funding mechanism that, in terms of how it works. There's not a lot of visibility. I was told at one point that the family history department, which is pretty good sized, was a small fraction of what the temple department budget was. So I can only imagine.
Do you have a sense what your budget was? Are you able to say? Or?
A couple $100 million, as I recall, was kind of annually what was going into family history.
And so if that's a small fraction, that would put the temple budget
multi-billion
a year.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if it's true or not. Just told this, but it was a pretty good source, so I don't tend to doubt it. The temple budget is large. I mean, the temple construction is really expensive, and the maintenance is also expensive. So there's a lot of money that goes into temples.
Sure. Did you ever see?
Anyway. But in answer to your question earlier, though, on this whole what makes you, I didn't really find it to be the case. It was the ongoing joke that had to be that, but I didn't find anything particularly earth-shattering. But I don't know. I'm not easy to
rattle.
shake.
So it didn't devastate your testimony working at church headquarters.
No, I mean, it gives you a personal view of general authorities that a lot of people don't hold because they think they're these spiritual giants. And while there were people that I met there that I thought were incredibly spiritual among the general authorities, mostly I just found them to be good people, mostly smart, mostly successful business people that are good at what they do. But I don't know that I found them to be like these spiritual giants, outside of a few. I mean, like I say, Elder Christofferson, I was so super disappointed when he did that press event after the November 5th policy, because it seemed so dishonest to me. And my personal experience with him is he's just such an incredible man that I actually sent him a letter after that, just expressing my disappointment of just knowing him personally and just the level of
what was dishonest about that?
Disingenuousness. Everything.
What?
Every reason that was given for the November policy is just complete nonsense. It's utterly dishonest.
How do you know?
Let's walk through it. So here's what he said. He said, we're genuinely trying to protect the children of gay parents from being taught something at church and then not experiencing that at home. And that's the reason that we won't allow them to be baptized. And let's just take that apart for a minute. So what you're saying, Elder Christofferson, is that you don't want them to attend church? No, we still want them to go to church. We're just not going to ask them to make those covenants. So basically, they're still going to be taught everything that they would have been taught before, right? Well, yeah. So it doesn't act, not baptizing them, not giving the priesthood, actually doesn't change anything in what they would get in this conflict that you're saying that they're going to get, unless you actually don't want them to come to church at all, which I'm pretty sure you won't say, even if you think it. Eliminating baptism does what? It stops them from having covenants with God? In what way is that helpful to someone who is living in a household that you would, by definition, call apostate? Not having the Spirit is more helpful than having it? Not having the priesthood to be able to bless that home and perhaps bring those parents back to repentance is better than having the priesthood? Help me understand doctrinally how that works, because I see completely in conflict with doctrine to me. So if you want my opinion as to what happened, and I don't think they can walk it back now, but this came up and it started to be an issue. As I understand it, there were a few wards on the East Coast and the West Coast that started to actively integrate the gay families into their wards. And it was raised to the attention of the general authorities, and it caught the attention of a few. There's a bunch of theories about where the policy came out of, some that I've heard from people that work there. But
like what?
I heard one that I considered to be somewhat credible, that it came from President Monson, and President Monson was not as functional mentally towards the end as he was before. How much dysfunctional, it's hard to judge, but he definitely was having moments of lucidity and moments of not being as lucid, but that he sponsored it, and there was not a desire to stand in his way, and so it ended up going out over and above. I don't know how true it is or not. I definitely heard it from someone that I would consider pretty credible. But beyond that, so this policy went out, and I can almost guarantee something like this happened. So it got raised as an issue and ended up probably at the Priesthood Executive Council, which is the one that does this kind of policy, that would do this policy review, or maybe the First Presidency. And maybe the First Presidency initiated it, and it went to the Secretary of the First Presidency, and they said, okay, so how should we approach this? And somebody said, oh, we've got an existing policy that we use for polygamous families. That one would just apply. Let's just use that. And that's what we ended up with. And it just, you can argue that it makes sense. I don't think it does, but you can argue that it makes sense in the polygamist families that are in the fundamentalist Mormon communities, because they're essentially living outside of the church, but kind of living inside of it. So it makes a weird kind of sense. It's a bad policy anyway, but it definitely doesn't make any sense for gay families. It's the reason why so many people have had issues with it when it came out is because it's anti-doctrinal. It just makes no sense when you set it side by side with the doctrine. So anyway, I was super disappointed in Elder Christofferson about that. I know.
So you think he was being intentionally dishonest?
I think that his role. I think that the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency decided what the message was, and Elder Christofferson's role was he was over public relations at that point in time, and he also has a gay brother, so they tend to put him out in front on all the gay issues. And I think his job was to carry the message, and he did what he was supposed to do.
So a company man,
yeah,
doing his job.
I don't think he believed what he was saying. I can't imagine he did. It's perfectly illogical, and he's an attorney who's an incredibly logical, thoughtful man.
And compassionate.
No way he can actually believe that.
So it must have broken his heart, if all those things are true, to be having to be that vocal.
Based on what I know of him, yes. That doesn't mean it's true. It's just what I know of him. But Did
he respond to your letter?
He didn't.
He didn't respond? Mm-mm. How was that? How did that feel?
It's, I didn't really expect a response. It's a super sensitive issue, and, I didn't really expect he'd respond to me, but it would have been nice. I mean, I worked with him for a lot of years.
So you were hurt that he didn't respond?
A little bit.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
It is what it is. He's in, sorry. He's playing a role, and he's a good man. And just like I say, like all of them, doing the best that they know how to do, which sometimes I wish they would do a little better. But maybe I wouldn't do any better in the role there. They have big shoes to fill. It's a complex, challenging job with a diverse set of members that they're trying to meet all of the needs at once. Excuse me. And I don't think it's an easy role. So I'm critical sometimes. I'm super critical of Elder Oaks at this point. And I'm mostly super critical because of, not because he teaches the doctrine. I think the doctrine of the church is what it is. Do I think some of it's wrong? Yes. But it is what it is. I understand him teaching the doctrine. But I think telling families that they ought not to include their gay family members in some things, telling them that it's okay to have them over for dinner, but they certainly shouldn't stay overnight in your house. I mean, let's just divide families in the best way we can. And by the way, I think the end result of the November 5th policy is basically to, in the long run, exclude gay people from the church. And I think this is probably the one time where I'll say I think there is some motives around this, because I think the more interaction members have with gay individuals, the more they come to understand that they're people. And they're people just like everybody else, and a number of whom want to be inside the church. And why in the world a gay person would want to be active in the church at this point is beyond me personally. I don't understand it, because it's like going to church and at least twice a month being told you're evil. But there are some that find huge value in it, and I respect them. And I think there's an effort to push them out because they don't want members to have that interaction. They don't want children.
What happens if members have that interaction?
They start to see them as real people, and then they start to say, wow, I can see why Joe would want to be married. And he's a really good guy, and I want him to be happy. It's the reason why the November 5th policy, I think, had a reaction that the church didn't expect. I think they didn't expect a wide reaction. Why did it? Because most families have a gay family member. And you actually know this person, and you love them. And you want them to be happy. Even if you think they're wrong and they're making bad choices, you still want them to be happy. And so members look at this and they say, here's my son, here's my nephew, my cousin. I want him to be happy. Why do half the millennials in the church support gay marriage? Because they have a bunch of gay friends. And they can't possibly see this the way the church sees it, because they actually know the person, not the concept of this evil homosexual pervert. They know a person that they love and care about. So this is why I think so many people have either had issues or left the church over this. Some because they were gay, but more because they just look at it and say, it just doesn't feel Christ-like. Again, so whether or not you teach the doctrine of that being gay is wrong, lots of churches teach that. I think they're all wrong, but lots of churches teach that. But teaching, going beyond that, and particularly some of the comments around transgender, this notion that gender is eternal, this is like a brand new concept. This is not something that exists in church doctrine prior to 15, 20 years ago. As a matter of fact, there's a bunch of teaching from Joseph F. Smith that everybody laughs about in terms of that your gender gets taken away unless you go to the celestial kingdom after this life. So I'd say they're kind of counter doctrine to this. So we treat the proclamation on the family like it is scripture, and it is not. It's never been canonized, and we treat it like it's doctrine that's been around forever, and it's not. So anyway, I'll quit editorializing.
No, we'll come back to that when we get to your story. Yeah. I'll just say that I was hoping that the church would, not enforce the November policy and not be excommunicating LGBT couples that chose to get married. I found out that Tuesday night they excommunicated another legally gay married couple who's been trying to attend church.
It's happening pretty regularly, not everywhere, and not all bishops and stake presidents, but it's happening regularly enough. They're definitely following through on it, for good or for bad. Yeah. There is one thing that I think will help it to change, and this is the cynical side of me for just a moment. So just as I was leaving church employment, one of the things that we were having discussions around was the convergence of a couple of things that were happening in the church. One was flattening and or decreasing rates of attendance in North America, coupled with dramatic growth in places like Africa and parts of South America, and basically mostly in the poorest kind of countries of the world. And the reason it's really relevant from a church perspective is because North America is the only area of the church in which tithing revenues exceed expenses. Every other area of the world gets subsidized by the North America church. And so as you start to see flattening rates of attendance and perhaps declining, and particularly flattening rates of tithing revenues and declining, and then you see the growth in the areas outside where they're not self-sufficient, you see expenses continuing to rise while income is level and or slightly declining in North America, where it's the one where you have positive results. And the projection when I left was that somewhere in the 5 to 10 year range, those lines would cross, and all of a sudden tithing income would be less than total church expenditures. And it was starting to change behavior. So there were things like, what can we do to get more areas of the church self-sufficient? So should we, for instance, in Africa, instead of building these really elaborate chapels that are the nicest building that the members might ever walk into, maybe we build pavilions, which are more typical of what they might experience to reduce costs. But what can we do in general to increase tithing revenues and decrease expenses so that at worst the church, the North American church, is subsidizing less, and at best they start to be self-sufficient. So virtually all of the area presidencies had objectives around improving their level of self-sufficiency. But this trend, and I suspect, given it was just after I left church employment that the November policy came out, and you had a pretty significant number of people exit shortly after that, I suspect that this problem's gotten worse, not better, and that those lines are converging more quickly. And while I don't think the church is completely motivated by money, it does have an influence. And when you start to see members having an exodus over this, I think the other thing that will likely have serious influence is the Area 70s. So in the past, I would say being a member of the church has been helpful to your career. So Area 70s all work. They're 70s, but they work full-time in a job. And most of them are pretty successful business people. And I think the church has generally been helpful to their career because the church has been viewed as family-oriented and honest. The church is starting to get an overhang of reputation around being of bigotry around the LGBT community. And I think at some point that starts to harm the careers of these Area 70s, where instead of being proud of being church members, now they have to be closeted church members, or they're viewed as a bigot, or they have to distance themselves personally from church policies in a material way, or they start to look like a bigot. And I think the combination of this church finance thing, plus membership leaving, plus the impact of stake presidents, area presidents on their membership and how they feel about their church membership, I think all of that converges. I don't think this will change in the 5-year range, but I hope it'll change in the 15, 20-year range.
So let's talk about kind of what some suspect is the core motivation of a lot of the temple activity. I mean, the church is building, with Monson and even Hinckley, but even now the church is building temples everywhere. It doesn't, and they're usually building them in foreign countries.
Yeah.
If the foreign countries aren't self-sufficient financially, it begs the question, how is it financially feasible to be building these temples in all these foreign countries, particularly places like Rome and Paris, France? Do you have a sense for, and of course, a longstanding theory in the post-Mormon community is that temples, when the church builds temples, and this is a very cynical point of view, that they see dollar signs, that
Sure.
that if you can build a temple and you can require tithing as a way to get in the temple, and then you can have people's sort of status in the ward be tied to whether or not they're temple going. And then specifically, if a kid goes on a mission, but the parents can't go into the temple with them, they're shamed for that. And if their kid gets married in the temple and the parents can't go, they're shamed for that. And so it's just much easier to, it's much easier for the parent to just pay the tithing and go versus face the public shaming of not being able to attend their own kid's wedding. Or even if it's not about public shaming, just a desire to attend your own kid's wedding. And so in some ways, the temple become this compulsory means of manipulating people to pay their tithing. And so it becomes this important revenue source for the church. Now, that's cynical, that people would think that. That's projecting kind of diabolical motives on the leaders. You've already said they're good people with good motives. What would you say about why the church keeps building all these temples everywhere? Is there a motive that we should know about or that you know of?
So I think that I would say there's two motives around building temples. One is a genuine interest in allowing temples to be closer to members so that there's less expense for them to travel to temples to do their ordinances. Because in some of these places, I mean, it's really expensive to go visit a temple. In Europe and parts of Africa, there's plenty of stories of people, going without food for periods of time to be able to go to the temple, and it's real. It happens in Africa, definitely. So I think there's a genuine desire to bring temples closer for that reason. The second is temples do increase activity. Having a temple in the area increases the key indicators of the church healthiness. Number of Melchizedek priesthood holders per member, the percent of tithe payers, the percentage of church attendance, the key metrics that are around is the church healthy in that area all go up when you have a temple. I don't know, is there some nefarious piece around tithing revenue? I don't know, maybe. It's talked about. It's not talked about in quite the kind of way of you'd think about it as a business, but it's still there. And I'm torn between whether or not I think this is around the view of that tithing paying is a one of the measures of spiritual health. And so you can judge kind of how healthy spiritually the congregation is by the tithe payers within it. And whether or not it's the dollars that come in. And I don't know, I'm too practical, and too many of these individuals are business people for me not to think that they don't think about the dollars and cents of what tithing means. And they have to manage the church's budget, and when tithing goes down, they have to figure out how to manage the church's budget against lower tithing revenues. So I can't think that they don't ever think about it. I don't think they're personally benefiting from this, but and I think it's mostly around how do we make the church secure in the long run financially. But it's also a measure of spiritual health. It's one of the reasons why family history, by the way, has been one of the key elements that I think has gotten more and more focus. Because when you look at the predictors of attendance in the church and attendance in the temple, a few of these are, if you got an Eagle Scout, you're more likely to go on a mission. If you go on a mission, you'll go through the temple, you're more likely to have a temple marriage, you're more likely to stay active into your adult years. All of these are predictors, but one of the ones that came out from, there's a group called RID at the church, I think they've changed their name now, but the Research Information Division, that goes out and surveys church members on things that they think, what their behavior is, there's some spiritual indicators in there. How often are they praying? How often are they having family home evening? How often do they go to the temple? But one of the things that emerged from that is one of the most serious predictors of temple attendance, tithe paying, all of these key indicators, is involvement in family history. If you are involved in family history and you are taking personal names to the temple, you are increase in all of these areas. Now, is it causal or is it just correlated? That is much harder to tell. But definitely involvement in family history has a positive impact on all of the spiritual indicators of health in a member and a unit that you can put metrics against. And one of those is tithing paying. So yeah, because obviously if you're going to the temple, you're a full tithe payer, or at least you say you are.
So the temples, the brethren would be motivated to build temples because their heavily temple work and genealogy work are strongly associated with high levels of devotion and commitment to the church.
Absolutely.
And there's likely, hopefully, some tithing benefit as well, maybe.
There is tithing benefit. I mean, when you build a new temple, the percent of tithe, I don't know the pure stats behind it, but I've heard enough discussion around it during my time at the church to say when you build a temple, tithe paying increases in the members around the temple. I think it's partly affected more people want to go to the temple, and so they get to be tithe payers, and it's proximate. So now it's not a 1,000-mile journey. Now it's a 100-mile journey to get to the temple. So it naturally increases in a radius around the temple the general spirituality, including tithe paying.
What do you think about Paris and Rome? What in the world would they be thinking about the exorbitant costs of those temples, given how low the membership is in those two countries?
I don't really know. I was there during the planning of the Rome temple in particular because we designed a family history center as a part of the complex. I'm not sure if it finally ended up getting built, but we were part of the architectural planning, and I had responsibility for family history centers during that time. So I don't really know why Rome. Maybe it's because it's Rome and it's near the Vatican and the kind of seat of Catholicism. I'm not sure. There's not that many members in Italy. There's not that many members in France. We're definitely not growing in either of those areas
shrinking
today. Yeah. Europe is shrinking in general. So why temples there?
Yeah, there are less members every year in Europe.
Absolutely. It's been shrinking for some time. So, so I honestly don't know. I mean, I interacted with the temple department off and on, mostly in terms of our system side and the interface there, but that it's a very closely held, there's a very small number of people involved in temple decisions. We rolled up to the same council, so it's the Temple Family History Executive Council. So once in a while we'd get some insight through the council on temple things. But rarely, both the budgeting side of it and the decision-making side of it. And so there's presiding bishopric departments, there's First Presidency departments, and there's kind of Quorum of the 12 departments. Temple and Family History is a First Presidency department because Temple is under the priesthood authority of the First Presidency. And the First Presidency is essentially who decides where temples go. The temple department makes recommendations, but sometimes the temple department is surprised when things get announced and where. So I think I don't know, at the moment, what's been interesting to watch is the number of temple announcements and yet the relatively slow pace of approval and construction. There's more temples approved but not started yet than I've ever seen in my lifetime, by a long way. So,
where else is the church shrinking besides Europe? Are you aware?
I would say, maybe I'll say where I think the church is growing. I think the church is stagnant to shrinking in the U.S. at this point. I know we're showing technical numbers of growth in the 2 to 3% range, but I think in realistic terms of attendance, I think the church is effectively shrinking in the U.S. at this point, or at least stable to shrinking. As far as I knew...
Did you get a sense the brethren were concerned about this?
Yeah, absolutely. Hugely concerned about the losses of youth. So I would say every church department was tasked with how do you come up with programs that will engage the youth better. And a part of the serious concerns about the temple inventory was that this as a kind of predictor, as a spiritual activity, as a predictor of future spiritual activity, the youth in the temple is really important. So it was a really hard decision when we reduced the number of names done, and particularly the number of times that youth groups could go to the temple. This is it's a serious problem. I mean, the youth losses in the church are just staggering at the moment.
Any idea what percentage? Was there ever rumors or discussion about what percent of the youth?
I've seen a few reports that were in the range of kind of between 50 and 60% of youth inactivity by the time you hit kind of Laurel and pre-stage. I've seen numbers as high as 70% losses into early 20s. It usually resurges when people have kids. So a bunch of them disappear and then they come back to church after they have kids. So you do a little bit of re-pickup, but it's been a steady decline. I think the only thing that's really keeping the church afloat from numbers in the U.S. is the birth rate in general among families, because the activity rates are seriously problematic. And the kind of rising generation is the numbers are. I don't know, if I just use my own family as an example. I mean, I think my dad has somewhere around like 50 grandchildren, and I would say there's maybe 8 or 9 at this point that are active. It's a really small number, and I don't think we're typical. I think we're atypically high for whatever reason. But I think it's not an unusual story to find more than half of the kind of individuals in the kind of 15 to 30 range, to find half of family members that are no longer active. And that certainly wasn't the case when I was young. I would say most of my family stayed active. I mean, of my siblings, now it's only half, but kind of growing up, it was only my one sister who wasn't active.
So it's kind of shrinking in Europe, shrinking in developed Asia.
I think the only places there's serious growth is Africa. Latin America and Africa. And Africa is by far the largest growth. Latin America has started to stagnate in some areas, from what I understand.
Yeah, there's definitely collapsing of wards and stakes in Mexico,
I think
Chile,
in particular.
Brazil,
I think Brazil is still growing from what I hear, and I'm not as closely connected with it as I was, but from what I hear, Brazil is still growing, but they're definitely seeing stagnation, if not a little bit of shrinkage in Mexico.
Yeah.